My name is Audrey Thompson. I'm 34 years old, and for 7 years I gave everything I had to one company: my time, my strategies, my results. These metrics are fake, Marcus Reynolds laughed, holding my 7-year performance portfolio like it was a piece of trash. He didn't just dismiss it, he threw it. The folder hit the floor in the middle of the conference room, slides scattering across the tile, while every eye in that room turned to me. Marcus was our VP of sales, the kind of man who took credit for numbers he never built and smiled while doing it. And right now, he was using that smile to erase 7 years of my life in front of an audience. "No regular employee closes deals like this," he said, louder this time, making sure everyone heard. "Someone helped her. This didn't happen on its own." I kept my face still, hands flat on the table, but inside, every nerve in my body was on fire. Then the door opened. Ryan Caldwell, our CEO, walked in unannounced, stopped mid-step, and looked directly at me. Not at Marcus, not at the folder on the floor, at me. And what he said next changed everything. Before we get into my story, drop a comment and tell me, what time is it where you are, and what city are you watching from? I want to see just how far this story has traveled. Walking out of that building, the memories came back all at once. I grew up in Columbus, Ohio, middle of the Midwest, middle of everything ordinary. My father was an accountant. My mother managed the books for a small hardware store. Numbers weren't glamorous in our house, but they were everywhere. And somewhere along the way, I started to love them. Not the math itself, the story behind the math. Why certain numbers moved, what they were hiding, what they revealed when you looked long enough. By the time I was in college, I wasn't just studying business. I was reverse engineering every case study I could find, mapping out what the data said versus what the report claimed. My professors called it obsessive. I called it necessary. I graduated with a degree in business analytics and a minor in statistics. Not the flashiest combination, but it was mine, and I knew exactly what I wanted to do with it. I joined Viridian Pharmaceuticals at 27 as a sales analyst, entry-level, standard salary, standard cubicle. The company was mid-sized but growing fast, operating across 12 regional territories with hundreds of sales reps pushing product to hospitals, clinics, and private practices. It was a machine, a loud, complicated, slightly chaotic machine. And the data running that machine was a mess. Nobody had told me that directly, but within my first 3 months I could see it. Sales reports came in weekly from each territory, compiled manually by regional coordinators, then passed upward through a chain of managers before landing on the VP's desk. By the time the numbers reached leadership, they were already 2 weeks old. Context had been stripped out, anomalies had been smoothed over, and the decisions being made from those reports were based on data that no longer reflected reality. I kept that observation to myself. I was new. I was 27. I had exactly zero leverage. Instead, I started building. During my first 2 years at Viridian, I spent nearly every evening and weekend developing a performance tracking framework from scratch. Not because anyone asked me to, not because there was a budget for it. I used shared spreadsheets, publicly available tools, and whatever access I could get through my analyst credentials. I mapped every regional sales cycle, average deal length, conversion rates by product category, rep performance variance by quarter, and the specific points in the pipeline where deals most commonly stalled. It wasn't elegant at first. It was ugly, manual, and slow, but it worked. By the end of year 2, the framework had evolved into something I called the Velocity Index, a composite metric that combined pipeline speed, product-to-physician match rate, and follow-up timing into a single score for each rep in each territory. It wasn't just tracking performance, it was predicting it. A rep with a declining velocity index score in week 3 of a quarter would almost certainly miss target by week 12. I could see problems before they became problems. The first real test came when I noticed a pattern in the Northeast Territory. 3 top-performing reps had strong individual numbers, but their velocity scores were dropping simultaneously, not because of effort, but because a specific product category had a reporting lag in the system. Reimbursement approvals were being logged manually, 2 to 3 weeks after the actual approval date. Reps were following up too early, losing momentum and losing deals, not from poor skill, but from bad timing built on bad data. I put together a 1-page summary and sent it to my direct manager, a regional coordinator named Janet Holloway. She forwarded it upward. 2 weeks later, the reporting lag was corrected. The Northeast team's close rate improved by 14% over the following quarter. Nobody announced what had fixed it. There was no meeting about the insight, no acknowledgement of where the solution came from. But the numbers changed, and I had documented everything. That became my pattern: find the problem, build the fix, measure the outcome, keep the record. The velocity index quietly became embedded in how 3 regional teams tracked their pipelines. Reps who used the framework consistently were closing deals faster and with fewer dropped leads. Directors started asking for the reports without knowing who was producing them. I was a name on an email chain. I was a tab in a shared folder. But the work was undeniable. By year 3, the results were impossible to ignore. The velocity index had expanded from 3 pilot territories to 8. Regional directors were requesting updated reports bi-weekly instead of monthly. And for the first time, I wasn't just analyzing other people's deals. I was directly involved in closing them. The biggest came in Q2 of that year, a supply contract with Medcore Health Systems, a hospital group operating 43 facilities across the Southeast. It had been a stalled account for over 2 years. 2 previous reps had worked the relationship and walked away with nothing. I pulled the full account history, ran the data against our product performance benchmarks, and identified a specific gap. Medcore's primary pain point wasn't pricing, it was post-sale support consistency across their smaller satellite hospitals. Our pitch had been wrong the entire time. I restructured the approach, built a customized performance guarantee into the proposal, and supported the assigned rep through every stage of negotiation. The contract closed at $4.2 million annually. It was the largest single account Viridian's Southeast Division had landed in 5 years. With that kind of visibility came a new responsibility I hadn't expected: teaching. Leadership asked me to run internal training sessions for the sales teams, not as a formal trainer, but as the person who built the system. I put together a 4-week curriculum covering how to read velocity scores, how to identify pipeline stall points, and how to adjust outreach timing based on product category. 32 reps went through the first cohort. Their average close rate improved by 11% over the following 2 quarters. I stood in front of those rooms and watched people take notes. It felt good. It felt real. The data work also opened a door I hadn't anticipated. During a routine analysis of regional performance gaps, I flagged that the Mountain West Territory, Colorado, Utah, Nevada, was being dramatically underpenetrated. The region had strong hospital density and a growing network of independent specialty clinics, but Viridian had only 1 rep covering the entire area. The pipeline was thin, not because of poor selling, but because of insufficient coverage relative to market size. I put the analysis in a formal memo, mapped the projected revenue opportunity at $6 to $8 million over 3 years with proper territory expansion, and submitted it through my manager. 6 months later, Viridian hired 3 additional reps for the Mountain West region and restructured the territory boundaries. I never received a formal acknowledgement for that recommendation, but I kept the original memo, time-stamped and filed. Then came the quarterly business review in November. Marcus stood at the front of the room with a presentation deck I had never seen before. The slides were clean, professionally designed, and filled with data points I recognized immediately, because I had built every single one of them. He walked the executive team through what he called a cross-functional performance initiative that had driven pipeline efficiency and contributed to record close rates in the second half of the year. He used my velocity index terminology. He cited my Medcore analysis. He referenced the Mountain West expansion. He never said my name once. I sat at the back of the room and watched. I kept my expression neutral. I did not raise my hand. After the presentation, Karen Whitaker spoke. She was Viridian's CFO, precise, data-driven, the kind of person who read footnotes. She nodded at Marcus and said the results reflected strong strategic thinking at the leadership level. She said the numbers were a credit to the sales organization. She said the company was heading into Q1 with better visibility than it had seen in a decade. Every word she said was accurate. Every word was about work I had done, and not once did she look in my direction. Marcus caught my eye from across the room. He gave a short nod, not an apology, not acknowledgement, just a signal. This is how it works here. I looked back at my notebook. I had 3 pages of notes from the meeting. Data points, follow-up questions, things to investigate before the next cycle. I went back to my desk that afternoon and started working on Q1 projections. Not because I had stopped noticing, not because it didn't sting, but because the work itself was the only thing in that building that couldn't be taken away from me, only borrowed, only delayed. I kept building, I kept documenting, I kept every file, every memo, every timestamp. That realization didn't arrive all at once. It accumulated, the way debt does. 7 years in, my base salary was $58,000, the same number on my offer letter from the day I walked in. No adjustments for performance. No corrections for inflation. No acknowledgement that the role I was doing in year 7 bore almost no resemblance to the role I had been hired for. I found out about the gap by accident. A new analyst named Derek had joined the Southeast team 8 months earlier, fresh out of grad school, no industry experience, strong handshake. During a casual conversation near the coffee station, he mentioned his starting package, $64,000, plus a quarterly performance bonus structure I had never been offered. He had been at Viridian for 8 months. I had been there for 7 years. I didn't say anything. I smiled, refilled my cup, and walked back to my desk. That night, I started building the portfolio. It took 3 weeks to compile. I pulled every deal I had touched, every training cohort I had run, every territory analysis I had submitted. I attached documented revenue outcomes, time-stamped memos, close rate comparisons before and after the velocity index implementation. I calculated a conservative estimate of the revenue I had directly influenced over 7 years, $31 million across contracts, process improvements, and territory expansions. I formatted it cleanly, printed it on quality paper, and put it in a folder with my name on the cover. It was the strongest case I had ever built. It was also the most personal. The review was scheduled for a Thursday morning. I arrived 5 minutes early, sat across from Marcus, and placed the folder on the table between us. I walked him through it section by section. The Medcore contract, the Mountain West expansion, the training program outcomes, the reporting correction that had recovered the Northeast team's numbers. I spoke clearly, kept my voice level, and let the data carry the argument. I asked for a salary adjustment to $78,000 and a formal performance bonus structure aligned with revenue contribution. Marcus picked up the folder. He flipped through it slowly, not reading, just scanning. Then he looked up and laughed. Not a polite, uncomfortable laugh. A full, open laugh. "These metrics are fake," he said. "No regular employee closes deals like this." He wasn't finished. "You supported the process, Audrey. That's different from driving results. These numbers belong to the team, not to one analyst sitting in the back of a training room." One quote. I kept both hands flat on the table. The door opened behind me. Ryan walked in. Not announced, not expected. He pulled out a chair, sat down, and looked at the folder still open in Marcus's hands. Marcus slid it across the table toward him. She's claiming personal credit for team-wide performance. Ryan looked at the cover page. Then he looked at me. There was no surprise in his expression, only the careful neutrality of someone who had already decided. The results have been strong, he said. But attribution in a collaborative environment is complicated. We recognize contributions at the team level. 2 sentences. Measured, corporate, final. Marcus closed the folder and set it on the edge of the table. Then he pushed it slightly toward me. Not a return, a dismissal. I picked it up. I stood. I said, "Thank you for your time," and I walked out. No raised voice, no slammed door, no final word designed to sting on the way out. I had already decided before I sat down in that room. The review wasn't about changing their minds. I had known for weeks what Marcus would say. I had seen the pattern too many times. What I needed was to hear it out loud, clearly, with a witness in the room. I needed to close the door myself, on my own terms. Herrick, HealthRise Intelligence Consulting, had sent me an offer 2 weeks earlier. Director of Sales Analytics, $112,000 base, equity participation, and a team of 4 reporting to me. A recruiter had reached out through a professional contact after the Mountain West expansion had been cited, without my name attached, in an industry newsletter. Someone had done the math I never got credit for, and they had found me anyway. I accepted the offer that afternoon. Signed the letter, scanned it, sent it back before 3 p.m. I gave Viridian the standard 2 weeks. I did not tell Marcus directly. I submitted the resignation through HR, professionally and without explanation. Some exits don't need a speech. The resignation letter was 1 page. Clean, formal, no grievances. I thanked the company for the opportunity. I confirmed my last working day. I offered to complete a full handover of all active projects and documentation. There was nothing in that letter that could be used against me, and nothing that required a response. HR acknowledged it within the hour. Standard protocol. 2 days later, the building felt different. It started with the small signals, conversations that stopped when I walked past, a meeting I wasn't invited to that I would normally have run, managers suddenly very interested in where specific files were stored. By mid-morning, my manager's manager had stopped by my desk twice without a clear reason. People were paying attention to me in a way they never had when I was producing the work that kept their numbers clean. The counteroffer came before lunch on day 3. Marcus called me into his office and slid a printed document across his desk. New title, Senior Analytics Strategist. Salary, $81,000. A discretionary bonus review at 6 months. He spoke quickly, with the energy of someone who had spent the morning being told to fix a problem. He said the company valued my contributions. He said there was room to grow. He said the review process hadn't fully captured what I brought to the table. Every sentence was something he could have said 2 years earlier. I looked at the document. I looked at him. I said I would think about it. I had no intention of thinking about it. The call from Ryan came the following morning. I was at my desk when my phone lit up. His direct line, not his assistant's number. I picked up. Audrey. His voice had lost its boardroom composure. I just got off a call with HealthRise. Is that where you're going? I confirmed it. There was a pause. Not long, but long enough to be telling. Ryan was not a man who paused. That's a direct competitor in the analytics consulting space, he said. I need you to understand what that means for your transition here. I understand it completely, I said. Another pause. Then the register shifted. Less legal, more personal. We should have handled the review differently. I want you to know that. He mentioned a new role being created at the director level. He mentioned a compensation package he was prepared to discuss that afternoon. He said my name twice more before the call ended, which was 2 more times than he had said it in the previous 7 years combined. I thanked him for calling. I told him my decision was final. Marcus made one more attempt the following week, not in an office, not formally. He caught me near the elevator on a Tuesday and spoke quietly, almost carefully, like he was choosing each word for a document rather than a conversation. He said the company needed continuity. He said the team would struggle without the frameworks I had built. He said, without quite saying it, that he was sorry. I told him the handover documentation was thorough and that the team would be fine. That was the last real conversation we had. The 2 weeks moved steadily. I completed every transition task I had committed to, updated every process document, ran 2 knowledge transfer sessions with the analysts who would absorb my responsibilities, and organized 7 years of files into a shared drive with clear labels. I did not rush. I did not cut corners. I left that place in better shape than it needed me to. On my last day, I packed a single box. There wasn't much: a few notebooks, a plant that had survived 3 desk moves, a coffee mug I had owned since grad school. I walked out through the lobby at 5:15 p.m. and did not look back at the building. 3 weeks stretched out in front of me, and I used them deliberately. I slept past 7 for the first time in years. I cooked actual meals instead of eating at my desk. I went through every notebook from the past 7 years, not for sentiment, but for clarity. I wanted to see the full arc of what I had built, documented in my own handwriting, before I walked into something new. The pattern was consistent across every page: identify the gap, build the solution, measure the outcome, keep the record. That was still my method. It always had been. By the end of week 3, I wasn't just rested. I was focused in a way I hadn't felt in a long time, the specific focus that comes not from pressure, but from choice. Rick was waiting, and this time I was walking in on my own terms. Rick operated differently from anything I had worked in before. The offices were quieter than I expected for an organization of their size. No open-floor chaos, no reps on phones in every corner, no performance dashboards running on wall-mounted screens. What I noticed instead were whiteboards covered in regulatory language, stacks of compliance documentation on every desk, and people who spoke in precise, careful sentences. This was not a sales environment. This was a standards environment. Elena Vargas met me at the front entrance on my first morning. She was the executive director of Hurstrick, mid-50s, sharp, the kind of leader who had clearly built her credibility through decades of unglamorous technical work rather than boardroom performance. She walked me through the building herself, introduced me to each team by function rather than by name, and spent 40 minutes in her office explaining exactly what the organization needed and why they had hired me specifically to deliver it. The title was Chief Strategy Analyst. The mandate was broader than the title suggested. Rick's core function was setting and enforcing revenue integrity standards for pharmaceutical sales operations across the industry, auditing how companies tracked, reported, and attributed revenue, and issuing compliance frameworks that member organizations were expected to adopt. The problem Elena laid out was direct. The existing standards had not been meaningfully updated in over a decade. Reporting methodologies that were considered acceptable practice still relied on manual entry systems, lagged data cycles, and attribution models that had no mechanism for distinguishing individual contribution from team-level output. The industry had grown significantly more complex. The standards had not kept pace. My job was to fix that gap, research the current landscape, identify where existing frameworks were failing, and draft a new compliance standard rigorous enough to hold up against modern sales analytics infrastructure. It was the largest scope project I had ever been assigned. It was also, structurally, exactly the kind of problem I had been solving informally for years. I started in week 1 with a full audit of the existing HRIC framework documents, 14 volumes of standards covering everything from deal attribution methodology to quarterly reporting cycles to rep performance benchmarking. I read every page. I flagged every point where the language was vague, where the methodology was outdated, or where the standard created an incentive for organizations to obscure rather than accurately report performance data. The list of gaps was longer than I had anticipated. By the end of week 2, I had mapped the full scope of what needed to be rebuilt. Attribution standards were the most urgent. The existing language allowed companies to report revenue as team-generated without any requirement to document individual contribution data. It was a structural loophole, and it had been there for 11 years. I requested access to Hurrick's full member database and began cross-referencing reported revenue figures against audited deal records. The patterns that emerged were consistent and damning. Organizations were systematically under-attributing individual analyst and strategist contributions while over-attributing results to leadership and senior management. It wasn't always intentional. In many cases, it was simply the path of least resistance created by the standard itself. The standard had been teaching companies how to misreport. Thomas Hargrove joined my work in week 4. He was Hurrick's lead data systems architect, methodical, technically precise, and genuinely good at translating regulatory language into operational requirements. Where I was building the analytical and policy framework, Thomas handled the systems architecture, what data infrastructure member organizations would need to implement the new standards, what technical thresholds were realistic, and where the compliance requirements would need phased rollout timelines to be achievable. We worked well together. He asked sharp questions and pushed back when my drafts made assumptions the data didn't fully support. That friction was useful. It made the framework stronger. By the end of month 2, the first draft of the new Attribution and Revenue Integrity Standard, internally referred to as ARIS, was 47 pages. It introduced mandatory individual contribution tracking at the deal level, required documented audit trails for all performance claims submitted to leadership, and established a new benchmarking methodology that made team-level aggregation contingent on transparent individual data. Month 3 was revision and stress testing. Thomas ran the draft requirements against a sample set of 12 member organizations' existing systems to identify implementation gaps. I revised language in 3 major sections based on his findings, tightened the audit trail requirements, and added an appeals and dispute resolution clause that Elena had flagged as a regulatory necessity. The final draft went to Hurrick's review board at the end of week 12, 91 pages, fully sourced, technically validated. Elena read it over a weekend and sent me a single-line email on Monday morning. This is the most rigorous standards document this organization has produced in 15 years. I saved that email, not for sentiment. For the record, the ARIS framework went live on a Tuesday, distributed to all 340 member organizations simultaneously. The rollout was deliberate and staged. Organizations had 60 days to conduct internal compliance assessments, 90 days to submit remediation plans if gaps were identified, and 6 months to reach full alignment before formal audit cycles began. Elena had insisted on the phased timeline. The goal was adoption, not punishment. The standard existed to correct a systemic problem, not to dismantle companies that had simply been operating under rules that allowed for imprecision. Within the first 2 weeks, Hurrick's compliance inbox received 87 inquiry submissions. Most were procedural questions. A handful were substantive, organizations flagging that their current attribution methodology had no mechanism for individual contribution tracking at the deal level and requesting guidance on implementation. Viridian Pharmaceuticals submitted no inquiry. I found out from Natalie Brooks. She had been a mid-level reporting analyst at Viridian during my last 2 years there, quiet, thorough, someone who noticed things and said very little about them in the wrong rooms. She had my contact information from a professional network connection and reached out by email on a Thursday afternoon, 3 weeks after the ARIS publication date. Her message was brief. Thought you should know, there's been an emergency leadership meeting every day this week. Nobody's saying your name out loud, but everyone knows. I read it twice, then I filed it. The picture she described over a follow-up call was consistent with what the compliance data would eventually confirm. Viridian's internal revenue reporting structure had been built entirely on team-level aggregation, no deal-level attribution tracking, no individual contribution audit trails, and a performance benchmarking methodology that had been grandfathered from the previous standard without modification. Under the old framework, that was acceptable. Under ARIS, it was a Category 2 compliance deficiency, triggering mandatory remediation and external audit review. The organization had 60 days to respond. They had not yet started. Marcus called me on a Friday. I let it go to voicemail. The message was 4 minutes long, measured at first, then less so. He said the new standard contained requirements that were operationally unrealistic. He said the implementation timeline was designed to disadvantage organizations that operated at Viridian's scale. He said, and this was the sentence I replayed twice, that the attribution tracking requirements read like they had been written specifically to target their reporting structure. He used the phrase personal attack once, clearly, without ambiguity. I did not return the call. Karen's message came 2 days later, through a mutual professional contact rather than directly. The framing was more careful. She wanted to discuss the remediation pathway, she said, and whether there was any flexibility in the audit timeline, given the scope of changes required. It was a professional inquiry, dressed in the language of a professional inquiry, but the timing, the channel, and the specific ask all pointed to the same underlying problem. Viridian was behind, they knew it, and they were looking for leverage they no longer had. I referred the contact to Herrick's official compliance support channel. That was the correct answer. The first formal audit notification went out at the 60-day mark. Viridian had submitted a partial remediation plan that addressed surface-level formatting requirements but left the core attribution methodology unchanged. The audit team, which I had no direct involvement in, by design, flagged the submission as insufficient and escalated to a full compliance review. Natalie sent a second message during that week, 3 sentences. They pulled the quarterly all hands. Ryan hasn't spoken publicly in 2 weeks. Medcore sent a contract review notice. Medcore, the $4.2 million account, the one that had taken 2 years of stalled attempts before the right analytical approach unlocked it. Revenue integrity compliance was a condition of Medcore's vendor agreements, standard language in hospital group procurement contracts that had become increasingly enforced as Herrick's audit scope expanded. A supplier under active compliance review triggered an automatic contract evaluation clause. Medcore's procurement team had legal and financial grounds to pause, review, and renegotiate. They exercised all 3. The contract didn't disappear immediately. These things rarely do, but the review process froze the renewal cycle, delayed the Q3 payment tranche, and put Viridian's entire Southeast Partnership portfolio under scrutiny by association. Other hospital procurement offices began asking questions. One regional distributor paused a pending agreement pending compliance confirmation. The first contract loss was formalized 6 weeks after the audit escalation. It was not catastrophic on its own. A single contract rarely is. But Natalie's message that evening said it plainly. People are scared. The kind of scared that doesn't go away with a meeting. I read it at my desk at Herrick, in an office with my name on the door, doing work that was mine from the first word to the last page. The conference had 1,200 attendees, 4 keynote slots, and my name on the opening morning. The National Pharmaceutical Revenue Integrity Summit was the largest industry gathering of its kind. 2 days of compliance updates, regulatory briefings, and strategic sessions attended by executives, legal teams, and analytics leadership from across the sector. Herrick had co-organized it. Elena had put me on the keynote program 6 weeks earlier, citing the ARIS framework as the centerpiece presentation of the conference agenda. I was preparing my notes in the green room when a staff coordinator handed me the front row seating list. Viridian Pharmaceuticals, 3 confirmed seats, Marcus Reynolds, Karen Whitaker, Ryan Caldwell. I read the names once. I set the list down. I went back to my notes. The presentation ran 45 minutes. I walked through the structural failures in legacy attribution methodology, the specific compliance gaps ARIS was designed to close, and the audit data from the first 90 days of the rollout, aggregate and anonymized as required, but the patterns were specific enough that anyone operating a non-compliant system would recognize their own numbers in the slides. I did not look at the front row more than necessary. I did not adjust my language or my data. I presented the same material I would have presented to any room. The questions afterward were substantive and technical. One came from Marcus. He stood without being called on, which drew a brief pause from the moderator. His question was framed as a compliance clarification, whether the individual attribution requirements under ARIS Section 4.2 might unfairly penalize organizations where collaborative deal structures made individual contribution tracking operationally complex. His voice was measured, his posture was composed, but the room understood what the question was actually asking. I answered directly. Section 4.2 had been specifically designed with collaborative deal structures in mind. Thomas and I had stress-tested it against 14 different organizational models before the final draft. The requirement was not that individual contribution be exclusive, but that it be documented. Collaboration and attribution were not mutually exclusive. The standard required honesty, not isolation. The room was quiet for a moment. Then the next question came from someone else entirely. The ethics complaint had been filed 4 weeks before the conference. Viridian's legal team submitted a formal grievance to HRIC's ethics board, claiming that the ARIS attribution requirements had been designed with specific organizational targeting in mind, that the standard constituted a professional conflict of interest given my prior employment at the company. The board reviewed it for 11 days. I submitted my response on day 3, 7 years of time-stamped documentation, every memo I had originated, every analysis I had filed, every process improvement I had proposed and implemented, with dates, with signatures from the managers who had received them, and with the performance outcomes that followed. I submitted the full file of the QBR presentation from Year 5, the one where Marcus had presented my Velocity Index framework as a team initiative. I included the original draft, my name on the cover, dated 3 months earlier. The board dismissed the complaint in full on day 12. Their ruling cited insufficient evidence of bias and noted that the ARIS framework had been developed under institutional oversight with full technical review by HRIC's internal architecture team. Insufficient evidence. That was the clinical language. The real language was in my archive. The ruling was made public as a matter of procedural record on the first morning of the conference. The same morning I was on stage. I had not timed it. The board operated on its own schedule, but the effect in the room was unmistakable. Everyone who needed to know knew before I said a single word. Viridian's compliance crisis had by then moved well past the initial audit escalation. 3 procurement partners had triggered contract review clauses. 2 regional hospital networks had formally suspended new vendor agreements pending compliance confirmation. The Mountain West Territory, the one I had mapped and recommended expanding into, had a new HRIC-certified competitor that had fully adopted ARIS requirements from day 1 and was actively pitching Viridian's existing accounts. The organization was not collapsing, but it was contracting, visibly and on the record. After the keynote, during the networking session, Ryan approached me near the registration desk. He looked like a man who had rehearsed what he was going to say and then decided at the last moment not to say it. He offered his hand. I shook it. "You built something that will last," he said. I nodded once. Yes. I walked back toward the HRIC table, where Elena was waiting with the afternoon panel schedule and a cup of coffee she had set aside for me. I sat down. I reviewed the schedule. I got back to work. There was nothing left to prove in that room. There never had been. The numbers came out in a quarterly filing, and they were not good. In the 9 months following my resignation, Viridian lost 11 contracts across 4 regional divisions. 3 of those were major hospital network agreements, the kind that anchor an entire territory's revenue projection. Stock dropped 22% over 2 consecutive quarters, which triggered a shareholder review that the board had not anticipated and was not prepared to manage. The layoffs came in 2 waves, 34 people in the first round, 61 in the second. Most of them were analysts and regional coordinators, the people who had actually been doing the work. That part was not satisfying to read. It never is when the people who get hurt are not the people who made the decisions. Marcus was terminated in month 7. The official statement cited a leadership restructuring in response to compliance remediation requirements. There was no public acknowledgement of what the restructuring actually meant, that the VP of Sales had overseen a reporting infrastructure that failed a mandatory audit, and that the failure had direct financial consequences the board could no longer absorb quietly. Karen followed 3 weeks later. Her departure was announced as a mutual decision. In the same week, Hrick's audit report on Viridian was formally entered into the industry compliance record, a public document, searchable, permanent. Ryan's situation was more complicated. He was not terminated. He was placed under an internal governance review initiated by the board's independent directors, examining executive-level awareness of the reporting deficiencies and the timeline of decisions made after ARIS was published. That review was still ongoing as of the date I am telling you this story. I did not follow it closely. I had work to do. At Hrick, the 6 months following the conference were the most productive of my career. The ARIS framework was adopted by 280 of Hrick's 340 member organizations within the first compliance cycle, a faster uptake rate than any previous standard the organization had issued. Elena moved me into a newly created role, VP of Standards Development. Thomas was promoted to lead a dedicated implementation support team. We began drafting a second framework. This one focused on clinical trial revenue attribution, a space with even more structural opacity than pharmaceutical sales. I was building again, bigger, with more resources, and with my name on every document from the first draft forward. People ask me sometimes what the takeaway is. They want a clean lesson, something transferable, something they can carry out of the story and apply on Monday morning. Here is what I actually believe. Documentation is not paranoia. It is professionalism. Every time I saved a file, time-stamped a memo, kept a copy of work that had already been handed off and claimed by someone else, I was not preparing for war. I was doing my job correctly. The archive that dismantled an ethics complaint and supported a compliance framework existed because I treated my own work with the same rigor I applied to everything else, not because I saw any of this coming. Credit delayed is not credit lost, but you have to keep the record. There will be rooms where your name is not said. There will be presentations built from your thinking that carry someone else's title on the cover page. There will be moments where the only person who knows the full truth of what you contributed is you. In those moments, the question is not how loudly you can object. The question is whether you have the patience and the discipline to let the work outlast the person who borrowed it. And the last thing, the one I think about most, leaving is not losing. The hardest decision I made in 7 years was not the portfolio, not the raise request, not the 2 weeks of handover. It was walking out of a building where I had built something real and choosing not to fight for recognition from people who had already decided I didn't deserve it. That felt like failure for exactly as long as it took me to sign a new offer letter. It wasn't failure. It was the first decision I had made entirely on my own terms. I am still at Hrick. I have no plans to leave. And if you have stayed with this story until this moment, thank you, genuinely. You gave your time to something that took me 7 years to live through and several more to understand clearly enough to say out loud. If any part of this story touched something you recognize, a room where your work was borrowed, a meeting where your name was missing, a moment where you stayed quiet when you had every right to speak, I want to hear from you. Leave a comment. Tell me what you took from this. Tell me where you are in your own story. because the point of sharing this was never just to close a chapter, it was to find out how many people were writing the same one.